All right, this video we're going to look at the genetics for chapter 3. So this is just a brief kind of biological overview. Hopefully many of you have learned a little bit of this before. So we all have lots and lots of genes, and with the advent of more advanced science, we are able to see if there are particular genes that are perhaps partially responsible for antisocial or criminal or delinquent behavior. So it's definitely been suspected in the past, but currently we do know of several genes, and I'm sure in the future we will have more genes that scientists have pinpointed they're responsible for this behavior. So before we had such specific technology with regards to particular genes, we learned about our biological risk factors from studying both twin and adopted siblings. So a little brief overview with twins here. One is dizygotic twins, or fraternal, which means that there are two eggs. These would be our non-identical twins, so they were two separate eggs that were fertilized at the same time in the mother's womb. Just like any other siblings, they share 50% of their genes, but they have the added sharing of their environment within the womb as well, as opposed to siblings that are separate in years, for example, of age. Next, we have monozygotic or identical twins, meaning that they were one egg and eventually split into two babies. And so they have identical genes, 100% shared genes, and not surprisingly, they look the same or identical. So to look at our image here, this is our fraternal twins. We have separate placentas and amniotic sacs. We have two eggs and two sperms. So that's how we're able to have twins that are one male and one female, for example, but they could also be male-male or female-female. They're just not going to be identical, even if they are born at the same time. Here we have our identical twins. Same placenta, but different amniotic sacs. They were one egg and one sperm at one point, but ended up splitting into two. So hopefully that is a little bit of review for us. So if genes matter, monozygotic twins or identical twins should display more of our similar behaviors than dizygotic twins or fraternal twins. And they use the word concordance, meaning that they're similar to. If one identical twin engages in antisocial behavior, then genetic risk for basically that similar antisocial behavior in the other twin should be high. So if genes really do matter, then we should see the same type of behavior in one identical twin and the other identical twin. If one is showing that behavior, like let's say one is getting into trouble a lot, is not able to sit still, those kinds of things, then we should be more likely to see it in the other because they have 100% shared genes. So what does the data show? What are we seeing? Basically, that there is a higher chance of the other identical twin showing that behavior if one shows it. So if one shows it, you're more likely to see the other one showing it as well. So we are seeing support that there is some kind of genetic influence over just our environment that they're sharing anyways, right? So if the fraternal non-identical twins are sharing the environment just like the identical twins, but the identical twins are more likely to share those types of behaviors, then it's not just the environment or being siblings, it's also something to do with the genes. Hopefully that makes sense. So we do see that, again, the monozygotic or identical twins are more likely to be showing that. And just as a side note, on a test or a quiz or anything like that, if you put monozygotic or identical to talk about the monozygotic or even MZ, I will accept that. And for dizygotic, you can write dizygotic, DZ, or fraternal. So there's a few different things that you can write that I would understand what you're saying. Okay, so if you have the identical twins and they were maltreated, you're at even greater risk for antisocial behavior. And we're going to learn more about this with particular video, but the environmental factors basically influence whether the genetics are turned on in a very simplistic kind of way. So you can imagine that all our genes are there and they could be flipped on if we encounter some kind of situation. So we have the readiness of our genes based on our genetics, but it doesn't necessarily take hold. It's not 100% if you have that gene that you're going to be antisocial, for example. But if you have the genetics and the maltreatment turns on that genetic factor, then they're even at greater risk of showing that antisocial behavior. So what's the issue with these types of studies? That's the twin and adoption studies. They're generally small samples, incomplete records, and self-reports from twins. So we're not getting necessarily the best data from these types of studies, but this is where we started off before we could isolate particular genes and learn about those aspects. So continuing on with this, we are seeing that our genes do play a role, and we're looking at this with regards to sibling and twin studies. So remember, siblings are 50% genes shared versus twins. If they're identical, 100%. If they're not identical, then still 50%. But another thing that twins share that the siblings don't is usually that shared environment, both within the womb and once they're in the world together. Siblings could share an environment, but they are years apart, usually at least 1 year, 9 months, 10 months. So that's something else to consider. If one sibling engages in that antisocial behaviors, we do see that siblings, brothers and sisters, are more likely to do this as well. But we do see that identical twins are more likely to than non-identical twins and other siblings. So again, we're seeing that genetic component very strong even within siblings and other types of twins. Also, more rare of a type of study, but there are certain times that we could see twins that were perhaps separated and adopted into different families, and we're seeing that, well, not necessarily twins separated, I'm sorry, but if you are put up for adoption and then we're able to see your biological father, understand like that kind of environment. If the father was a criminal, then we're more likely to see that adopted child displaying those types of behaviors. So if the child was adopted and that father is a law-abiding citizen and just fine, but the biological father is a criminal, you're more likely to have that adopted child displaying some of those issue behaviors, again, pointing towards our biology and our genetics, even though they are adopted and not raised by that person. Okay, so here would be a good time to take notes on the first video. So go ahead and stop here and watch video 1. Okay, so here we have talk of our warrior gene. So everybody has a version of the MAOA gene, but this one is version L, or the warrior gene. And this is the one that the video talked about having particular ties to that aggressive behavior. So roughly 1/3 of our Western population has this variant L gene, or the warrior gene. And basically it's less of the MAO that's produced. So it's less neurotransmitter that's broken down, which means that there are higher levels left in the brain. This has led to more likely for that person to aggress and more likely to be impulsive, because there are more of those neurotransmitters left in the brain that weren't able to be broken down. Again, we have that flipping on or off of this genetic factor based on an adverse environment. So if you're raised in a good environment, you might not actually have this gene affect behavior and be turned on. But if you are in an adverse environment, you're more likely to have this gene flipped on and then show these aggression and impulsive behaviors. So far we've got 7 genes that are associated that we know, but of course this will likely grow with more research into this area. We do find that they have some kind of control over the prefrontal cortex, as we just saw with that previous gene. So it's some kind of either structural or functional problem. The MAOA-L gene was a functional problem where we're leaving the neurotransmitters there, which is leading to more impulsive and violent behaviors. So we do have, well, for this chapter, we're going to be talking more about the prefrontal cortex. Let me just see something. Oh no, we're good. All right. We have our relationships between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, and our behaviors that are a result of the interactions between both our prefrontal cortex and our limbic system. So let's say you are driving to school and someone cuts you off. It's almost an accident, your heart is racing, but thankfully you are fine and your vehicle and the other vehicle is fine. You may have the urge to yell and scream at that driver, and that would be our emotional limbic system kicking in right at that time. But we use our prefrontal cortex that's rational, and we look for the appropriate response for this particular situation. So you're in your car, you make it, you're upset, but you look over and there's a man with a gun, and so for safety you decide to not say anything. Smart. But let's say you see an old lady there. Again, probably not going to necessarily be yelling at the old lady. What if it's a bunch of teenagers that are screaming and laughing and making fun? Maybe more so. Or again, this man with the gun, the Terminator, let's just say nice things and move away. Okay. With regards to teenagers, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but they have an immature prefrontal cortex. This is the last thing that develops in your brain, and it develops fully in your mid-20s. So we've got unable to really fully control ourselves. Not able to maintain control over ourselves and our impulses. Particularly with ADHD, we have under-aroused prefrontal cortexes and creates even more issues for those persons.